Welcome. This is one of the CLAS speaker series, which is a series of lectures, talks that we organize sometimes every 2 weeks, sometimes more often, with Latin American scholars and Latin Americanists that are here. If this is your first time coming to one of our events, please register and put your email in our website so you can receive our newsletters. Actually, there is another one coming up next week. So, I'll talk about more at the end. But just for you to know that this is part of our goal and our mission to make the Center for Latin American Studies really a center for intellectual and academic exchange, and especially exchange between Latin American scholars based in Latin America and Latin Americanists based in the US. Today, we have the honor to host Professor Maria Regina Celestino, who is one of the pioneers in Brazil on the history of indigenous peoples in Brazil. She's been doing research about that for decades, and very, very lucky to have her part of our exchange between CLAS and the Laboratory of Oral History and Image at the Universidade Federal Fluminense. Regina is a professor at Universidade Federal Fluminense, and we are developing this, what we hope will be a long-term collaboration between the two labs in the two universities. So Regina, welcome, thanks for coming. And she will talk about her research now about indigenous and Black peoples in Brazilian history and historiography.
Thank you, Taylor. Thank you, Paulo, as well. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for being here. It's very nice to be here to talk about the issues with you. And I will give a bit more explanation about the theme, Indigenous and Black Peoples in Brazilian History and Historiography. As Kayla said, I am a specialist in indigenous history. I've been working on indigenous who are inserted in colonial and colonial societies. But always, since I began to study, I always had a very close dialogue with my friends who work and colleagues who works with Black slaves and African and Afro-descendant peoples, because the themes are quite, let's say, cousins in terms of theoretical and methodological ways to think about questions. But I've done these since my PhD. But in recent times, some years ago, I began to think about these people more than in a comparative way, always trying to study them in an articulated way to understand better the process in which they were involved, and mainly in the process that made them invisible in the 19th century, and that make them being today, in our days, in 20th and 21st century, developing these ethnogenesis movements to reaffirm their rights based on identity and racial and ethnic identities. So that's it. So I began to talk about the thing, indigenous and Black peoples in Brazilian history and historiography. So first question is, who are they and what do they have in common? They are different peoples of the American and African continents, generically classified as Indians and Blacks, who were brought into colonial societies under conditions of extreme violence, and both appeared in Brazilian history for a long time only as slaves or as a labor force, rebels or victims incapable of political action. actions, many of them who, for different reasons, were made invisible during the 19th century, reappear today through ethnogenesis process, encouraging new studies on their trajectories. Despite all violence, they were able to rebuild their cultures, identities, and social networks in process of interactions with each other and with other actors in colonial and post-colonial societies in Americas. Not only in Brazil, this kind of process happened also in other Latin American. Next one, please. Since the last decades of the last century, important historiographical revisions have provided new narratives about the histories of Indians, Africans, and their descendants. These revisions are due both to the academic advance of increasingly dialogues, especially between history and anthropology, and mainly to the social and political movements of these people in search for rights. Rights that are anchored in the recognition of ethnic racial identities, since it is through the affirmation of these identities that indigenous and Afro-descendants communities present their claims. Some theoretical perspectives are important for discussing the issues presented here. First of the idea that cultures and identities, far from being static, are continuously transformed in the contact experience between various ethnic and social actors. This is essential for the current historiographical rereadings about these peoples. Also fundamental is the idea that ethnic classification categories are historical and carry distinct and changing meanings according to time, space, and social agents. And it's important also that these meanings matter as much for the classifying agents as for those who are classified. They knew that being classified in one way or another implied political and social economic gains or losses. Articulation between past and present. The current trend in historiography to articulate past and present is an important way to understand the trajectory of these people, especially about the issue of their ethnic and social identities and about the process of their invisibilization in the 19th century and the reaffirmation of ethnic racial identities in their struggles for rights, mainly for lands in our days. And I'd like to affirm the importance of connected histories of indigenous peoples, Africans, and their descendants. Besides comparing this process involving Indians, Africans, and their descendants, it is important to reflect on them in an articulated way, considering that the policies designed and implemented for them were influenced by their existence, actions, and choices in their interactions among themselves and with other social and political actors. Connecting their history is important for a broader and more complex understanding of the process studied. And I want to point out with Gerald Snyder that the process of deconstruction and reconstructions of ethnic identities of subaltern people, such as Indian and Blacks and Americans, go hand in hand with process of deconstructions and reconstructions of their histories. We can discuss these later on. I was just putting the things that are important to take into account. Another one, please. There's that. So from this perspective, the current ethnogenesis movement led by indigenous and Afro-descendants invite us to reflect on several issues from the past. 3 of them will be discussed here. the problematic of ethnic and social classification of Indians, Blacks, and their descendants, the interactions between them since the colonial period, and the process of invisibilization of their identities that occurred mainly during the 19th century. So the focus is 19th century Brazil, with some incursions to previous and subsequent periods. And I intend to reflect on the constructions and meanings of image, speech, silence, and forms of ethnic and social classifications on Indians and Blacks in a comparative way, and also taking into account their own political and cultural actions that led them to assume or reject identity attributed to them. And one observation is that I base these papers, the ideas that I'm presenting here on my own research on Indians in Rio de Janeiro. And the primary sources are mainly worked by me, are mainly these, and also in the works of the research of my friends who worked with Indians in different places in Brazil, and in the works of my colleagues who worked with Africans and Afro-descendants peoples. Some of them are exactly here in front of me. So, six. Let's talk about the first question, ethnic and social classification. Blacks, Indians, and their descendants. Several historians have worked with Indians and Blacks in an associated way. Among them is Stuart Schwartz, who stated that ethnic classifications and their respective meanings for different agents are constructed in a referential way among them. Therefore, they must be thought of in an articulated manner. It's worth remembering that, already said, but let's repeat. Indians and Black are broad generic categories to refer to the many different native peoples of America and Africa who were incorporated into the colonial slaveholding societies under conditions of extreme violence. Subjected to enslavement and compulsory labor, they occupy the lowest social strata of these societies and were subjected to blood cleansing statutes that prohibited the access to honorific, difficult to say this word, honorific titles, and also public and ecclesiastical positions. Mestizos constitute a third category that is even broader and more generic than the first ones, insofar as they refer to the descendants of the physical, social, and cultural crossing of diverse people. As Stuart Schwartz and Abby Matos have reminded us, as colonization progressed, new categories of mestizos proliferated to classify new ethnic and social groups, resulting from the slave trade, the descending expeditions, migrations, mixed marriage, and the process of freedom and social mobility. Descending expeditions were the expeditions that moved Indians from their places of origins to colonial and post-colonial societies. The circulations among them were intense, and people and individuals of African and indigenous origin circulated among physical, social, and classificatory space. So, yeah, that. It's important to consider that the classificatory categories are historically constructed and carry different meanings that change in the play of relations between the various actors. Discrimination against Indians and mestizos was smaller than that against Blacks. The stigma of slavery, much stronger among the Blacks than among the Indians, had a considerable weight in this difference. It's worth pointing out, and with Schwartz, that even before Pombau's policy, Marquês de Pombal policy in the mid-80s, the discrimination against Indians and mestizos was smaller than that against Blacks. As Abby Matos states, in the 17th century, in some regions, Blacks were already practically synonymous of slave. Not to mention that Indian slaves were called negros da terra, blacks of the land. No, it's the same. The controversy, which is, no, the other one, the 7-1. Yes. Variations and ambiguities. The controversies and imprecisions of the sources in which peoples and individuals may appear in differentiated forms, sometimes as blacks, pardos, sometimes as Indians, sometimes as mestizos, caboclos, or even whites, may result from the interests of the registering and or registered agents and can point to social mobilizations. To question the ethnic classifications and understand their different meanings for the various agents in contact is essential to understand the identity constructions of these people at specific times and their changes in the dynamics of events. Subaltern peoples and individuals were aware of the social weight of ethnic classifications and were concerned with them, assuming or rejecting them depending on the conditions. The controversies and disputes over ethnic classification become much more visible in the documentation after Pombal's reforms, especially in relation to Aldeado Indians. And now I must explain who are the Aldeado Indians. They are the Indians because the great classification that divide the Indians into two great generic classifications in Portuguese colonization in Brazil, and it kept on being like that in the 19th century, was to divide them in between the allies of the Portuguese and the enemies, which were the wild Indians and the Aldeados Indians, the ones who entered colonial Aldeia and were under the administration of Portuguese, because they established deals, agreements with the crown, and they were submitted to many obligations, but also they had some rights. Mainly, I think that most important ones was the rights of the collective lands of the aldeias and the right of not being enslaved, unless they were subjected to compulsory labor. So that's because the Aldeado Indians are the ones who I am working here. Huh? Understand? Besides forbidden, and the Pombal's reforms was marked in the indigenous policy in Portuguese colonial. We can talk about this later, but it's important to explain that. Besides forbidding the enslavement of Indians under any circumstance, the Indian Directory, this was the law, the new legislation from the mid-18th century, sought to end the discrimination against them while maintaining and accentuating the prejudice against Blacks. One of its items of this law spoke of the infamy of calling Indian Blacks. Thus, despite being kept in an inferior position in the social hierarchy, the Aldeados obtained with the new law some advantage, especially in relation to other subaltern groups, such as the wild Indians and the Black slaves. The parish documents are very important to let us know about social mobility. By working with parish sources, statistical maps and inventories of the parish of Nossa Senhora dos Anjos, which is in Rio Grande do Sul, nowadays the state of Rio Grande do Sul, but it was the capital of São Pedro do Rio Grande. And this place was an aldeia, indigenous aldeia before. She notes the documentation, the whitening and the coloring of the registered, and pointed to the likelihood of identifying through their possibilities of social mobility, both for Porros and for Indians. Leônia Rezende identified in Minas Gerais in the 18th century numerous petitions from urban slaves who, based on their Indian identity, refused to marry Black slaves, asserting their right to freedom. She also found petitions from Indians who denied the condition of being pardo in order to free themselves from enslavement. Aldeados Indians from Rio de Janeiro, Espírito Santo, and other regions of the Melanesians denied the condition of being mestizos in order to affirm the indigenous identity that guaranteed them the right to collective land and community life. The growth of Pardo category that included both indigenous peoples and Afro-descendants undoubtedly contributed to invisibilizing them, but it is important to consider the different meanings for both. For indigenous people, the category could mean loss of rights, such as freedom and collective lands. For Afro-descendants, both free or enslaved, it could be a possibility of social ascension and greater security against the threat of enslavement. Worth remembering with Matos that the term black, negro, and preto were used throughout the colonial period and well into the 19th century to refer to slaves and forros. I'm not going to enter in these questions about Pardo, but it's quite complex. But it's important to point that there are studies that show the valuation of the category of Pardo by Afro-descendants. And Larissa Viana has very interesting studies about the showing how in Recife in the 17th century, the Pardos tried to obtain the recognition of the first Pardo cent. Also in Salvador, the revolt of tailors in 1798 in Bahia included among its main demands equality between whites and pardos. So this is important to see that identity reference of groups or individuals are constructed in relation to other groups with which they interact and according to the social places they occupy in society. It's important to emphasize, however, the complexity of these issues, which include a wide range of possibilities. The considerations I am presenting here refer to the studies cited and should not be generalized because undoubtedly there were some situations in which Indians were interested in identifying themselves as mestizos and Black people as Africans. And these issues will not be discussed here. I'm trying specific case. That's why I'm saying we have always two specific space, case, and groups. So you can change time. Throughout the colonial period, indigenous and African peoples reconstruct identities, cultures, and histories interacting with each other through relations of both clash and alliance. If most of the time they have clashed, aligned themselves with the constituted powers to fight each other, there were also several occasions of alliance where they united for common cause. They have also mixed a lot through intermarriage, shared life, and struggle experience that often led them to assume common histories and identities, as current research is revealing. On several occasions, especially in quilombos and aldeias, Indians, Africans, and their descendants interacted, mixed, and incorporated themselves to each other in disputes and alliance for better possibilities of survival. Quilombos, I think everybody knows here what quilombos in English tem maroon communities, the place where the como é que
Maroon community.
Maroon societies, maroon communities.
maroon communities. So, quilombolas incorporated indigenous people. Maroon communities incorporated indigenous peoples in their communities, just as the aldeados integrated Black people into their aldeias. There are lots of studies about this nowadays. By living common experience and especially shared political struggles, they developed the feelings of ethnic communion, pointed out by Max Weber as one of the basic factors for the constitution of an ethnic group. Ethnogenesis process through shared experience ethnogenesis process were built since the colony through shared experience and struggles for better survival possibilities. In this process, Indians may have become Blacks and Blacks may have become Indians. So we can change, please. This is what we can see in the statement of a 19th century memorialist about the Aldeia of Mangaratiba. Interested in the extinction, Aldeia de Mangaratiba is in the captaincy of Rio de Janeiro and then province of Rio de Janeiro. Interested in the extinction of the Aldeia, he wrote to demonstrate that its inhabitants were no longer Indians, but mestizos. According to him, the aldeia was formed with Indians coming from Porto Seguro and several other aldeias. Porto Seguro was another aldeia in Bahia. The captain major made, this is what he said, the captain major made them recognize as if they were from the same lineage and the same aldeia, and as such they were considered. There were also some colored men who were either persecuted in the places where they lived or for other reasons sought protection of the aldeia. To defend the idea of the aldeia's extinction, he argued that the number of Puritan Indians was small and the aldeia was almost extinct, since the representatives of the primordial Indians did not exceed 20 or 30, and the others, who still called themselves Indians, were already mestizos in 6th or 7th generation, or descendants of Indians from outside, from other aldeias. So these statements shows not only the ethnic mixture and the mestiçagem inside the aldeias with the incorporation of the colored men, but also the identifications of the Indians living in Mangaratiba's aldeia with them. These intense interactions and mixture experience since the colonial period allow us to understand many of current process of ethnogenesis in which Black and Indians appeared mixed. And where do they come from if many of them had been considered extinct? You can change. Because many of the people, not in Rio, but in Northeast, many indigenous people who were considered extinct are now returning in ethnogenesis movements. So we arrive to the third issue. The process of invisibilization of these people took place mainly during the 19th century and for various reasons. In addition to the interests of the state in the population whitening policy encouraged mainly in the last decades of the 800s, the invisibilization process of Indians and Blacks to be understood, taking into account also their own interests and political actions. The enormous diversity of peoples and individuals that in the 19th century could be classified in the categories of Indians, Blacks, and mestizos with all their modalities opens an immense range of possibilities of actions and choices, which will not be discussed here. Therefore, it's necessary to specify groups to be compared. I focus especially on the Aldeado Indians and Free Blacks, trying to demonstrate how the former, the Indios Aldeados, act to try to preserve their ethnic identities, while the Free Blacks try to get away from the stigma of color that in the 19th century slave society sounded to them as a threat of great slavery, as demonstrated by Abbe Matos. Thus, while I think we can say that, while the Aldeado Indians were invisibilized, some Free Blacks may have been invisibilized themselves. Both acted to guarantee their liberties and better chance for survival by accepting or refusing the ethnic classification attributed to them. After Brazil's independence, the political and intellectual elites, because we have also to think all these in the context of independence and what was the ideological way of constructing the nation and the state and so on. After Brazil's independence, the political and intellectual elites of the new state were faced with the challenge of building a nation according to the European model they pursued, a white, civilized, and progressive nation. How to do this in a slaveholding society whose population was predominantly of indigenous and African origin? Although the policy of whitening the population gained its strength later in the century, it was already present in earlier political and intellectual discussions, especially in Instituto Histórico e Geográfico Brasileiro. Von Marshall's proposal to write the history of Brazil launched the idea of the myth of racial democracy, linking the country's development to the improvement of free race. So I'm making it very resumed. Indians and African peoples were incorporated into the Brazilian people in the 19th century and disappeared as differentiated ethnic groups at the level of discourse, while they remained alive, distinct, and active in search of better living conditions. However, from the it was easier, I think, to do this in an ideological way. From the political and social point of view, the issue was much more complicated, especially due to immense ethnic and social diversity that characterized the Indians, the Africans, and their descendants. How to incorporate them, assuring them some rights, and at the same time, keeping some of them, or the majority of them, subordinated in order to guarantee the necessary labor force for productive activities. Without getting into the complex debate about this, it's important to point out that the Constitution of 1824 opened possibilities for free Indians and Blacks to become citizens, which undoubtedly contributed to the erasure of their differentiated ethnic identities. Considering the precarious conditions of freedom of subordinate people, who even in the free condition lived under constant stress of being enslaved, or subject to compulsory labor and forced their recruitment to join military troops, access to citizenship could sound like a possibility of social ascension and escape from these threats. The question, however, is also quite complex, given the diversity of situation experienced by different peoples and individuals. For the groups I'm focusing on here, the Aldeado Indians and the Free Blacks, achieving citizenship could have different meanings, taking into account the efforts to guarantee not only conditions of freedom, but also the rights they had conquered. According to Abbe Matos, for the growing population of Free Blacks in the 19th century, Being a citizen also meant getting away from the stigma of color, essential for them to the extent that being Black or even Pardo implied the possibility of being enslaved. They sought to distance themselves from the classification as Black and acted by building different ways of living as free people. In Mato's analysis, silence about color is presented as a form of affirmation of the condition of freedom in the face of the fear of race slavery. In the first half of 19th century, slavery was not yet questioned, but there were heated political discussions for the end of the traffic, and especially against discrimination based on color. Black intellectuals intensely involved in these discussions, such as Antonio Rebouças, defended the idea that the distinction should be between slaves and free citizens. The latter should have equal rights as active citizens, being able to be electors and legible provided they had sufficient resources to do so, according to the determinations of the census criteria for the exercise of citizenship. Thus, during the 19th century, when many communities of Blacks, former slaves or not, established themselves as free men who organized themselves in space of agricultural communities, often on the lands of the very farmers where they had served as slaves, some donated by former masters, they would not affirm their differentiated ethnic condition. For this reason, perhaps, these groups became auto-invisibilized as Afro-descendant peoples to safeguard their conditions of freedom. This is what may have occurred, for example, with the Quilombola community of São José da Serra and also by Bracuí, these places which are studied nowadays for Eddie, Kayla, Marta, etc. So in the Quilombola community of São José da Serra today has its land recognized and demarcated. It's a community with kinship ties that over time maintained shared agricultural activities in the territory that was donated to them by the owner of the farm after the abolition. They have remained there until today, when they developed the movement of ethnic reaffirmation and the conquest of rights guaranteed by the 1988 constitutions. This is what was studied by Hebe Matos and Ana Lugão Rios and Marta Abreu. And a similar situation can be observed in the Quilombo of Bracuí, Maroon community of Bracuí, whose territory was also donated by the owner to the former slaves, who have remained there until today, when they also began the process of struggle for ethnic reaffirmation and guarantee of territorial rights. In relation to the Aldeado Indians, it's interesting to observe different behaviors in terms of assuming or denying their ethnic identities. Since the mid-18th century, the assimilation policy aimed to end the distinctions between them and the other king's vassals in order to extinguish their aldeias. In the 19th century, this policy was intensified, and throughout Brazil, the process of extinction of old colonial aldeias took place with the discourse that the Indians were civilized and mixed with the mass of the population, which legally justified the end of the aldeias. The controversies over ethnic classification then become much more visible in the sources of this period, especially in the second half of the century, when in several regions of Brazil, the aldeias were declared extinct. While authorities and town councils affirmed the state of mixture, decadence, and disappearance of the Indians and their aldeias, the latter, Índios aldeados, remained in them, claiming rights and demarcations of their lands, based on the affirmation of their indigenous identities. So that's the last one. So despite the discourse of invisibilization that could be assumed or not by the different groups in the 19th century, there is no doubt that many indigenous peoples and Afro-descendants remained united, sharing lives and community space as the current ethnogenesis movements reveal. Instead of disappearing, they were classified differently. As occurred in other American countries, the homogenization of the indigenous and Afro-descendants populations in Brazil and their disappearance as protagonists of history in the 19th century occurred only at the level of ideas. Several groups considered extinct continued, in fact, present and politically active, as demonstrated by recent research and the innumerable ethnogenesis movements of the 21st century. And thank you, that is it. And
Thanks, Regina. The floor is open for questions. I have some questions if no one, Paulo will go first.
Regina, it's always a pleasure to listen to you talking about your analysis of indigenous and Black people connection away. And you, of course, have shown a lot of connections, but I have a question, a specific question about how racism could also be a point of thinking together indigenous and Black people.
I answer straight. Wow, very good question. Very good question, because when I thought, I didn't tell you before, but these tests I had presented before, and part of this is already published as well. But after that, Paulo invited me to participate to a seminar in UFI about racism, and I said, what is indigenous racism? But I must think about this, and I never had. And I began, because I had begun to read some papers of friends who began to think about this about indigenous racism. It's a thing that's not very frequent, worked among historians, and also among the Indians themselves. The indigenous movement didn't talk a lot about racism. The indigenous movement of the 70s, for instance, they didn't talk about this. So I went, and so I began to think about this, and it's very important, because the questions came to me first. The Indians themselves nowadays, the indigenous leaders, the intellectual indigenous, are talking about racism and calling attention that it's important to talk about this. So I began to think, and I began to think also in this comparative way with the Blacks. So as you remember, I told here that the discrimination, because I don't talk about racism, but I talk about discrimination, prejudice, and disrespect of their rights in the law, because I've talked about some rights that the Indian Aldeias had, but even these groups, they were very often disrespect in their rights. They were conscious of the rights. They wrote to the king, they asked the rights, but they were very disrespect. And because they were Indians, the prejudice and the racism was there. So I began to think of these, and it was the Indians themselves who called the attention about this thing. And we can see that since if the racism, because I didn't think the racism is something of the 19th century, the concept but they were discriminated. The construction of the inferiorization of the other, as it is about the Black people, is the same about the Indians, but in different ways as well. And Stuart Welch has a very interesting works about this, because he worked with both in a comparative and articulated for a long time. And so we only showed how the Indians were less discriminated than the blacks. And I told this, but in the terms of, you can think this in the terms of races as well. And because the races were there, they were disrespected, they were considered inferior, and so on. So, and thinking of this in a comparative way is also very important as well. So I think it's something that I'm beginning to think of, and it's important, and mainly because the Indians themselves are asking for this. They're saying that it's important to think of this. And it was very interesting because I learned an Indian saying that he learned that was racism for a negro in the Universidade de Brasília. Was the black that showed him that he would suffer racism. I don't know if I
As anyone, while people are still shy, I was wondering, like, following upon Paulo's question, the whole discussion about reparations.
About
reparations.
reparation.
How you do this intertwining, because there's the struggle for land and for rights broadly defined, but the contemporary discussion about reparations is very much started in many kinds of Black movements, and the indigenous movement or indigenous groups came here. But I was wondering if you could talk more about the ways in which reparations.
And I'm not sure if the movements of indigenous people about their rights and reparations came later, because they were we didn't know about it, didn't appear, because in 1970 they were very active. Everybody, the academic studies thought until the 70s, even the great defenders, can I say defenders? The great the Cibero and all the Fernandes, all the big academic people who were defending indigenous cause. But the idea, the theoretical idea, is that there was no way they were going to disappear anyway. So let's try to. And then the movement, indigenous themselves, they were growing. They were asking for land. They were asking rights. And the Constitution of 1988, they were there. They did a lot of things. But I think that there's difference between the thing about repair, because for them, so that's why I say that we have to compare communities, to compare Black people, Black movements and indigenous movements. I compare with the communities. The quilombos are the way to compare, because I'm talking the rights of the community groups who live together, these rights. Nowadays it's changed, because a lot of indigenous who are individuals in the city and so on, but I'm talking about the groups. And so they are compared to quilombolas. Do you understand? So they always had their rights because they were Indians. So that's a great difference that I see with the Black. And this discourse of disappearance for them is very strong, because they lose rights because of this. And so I've heard the indigenous are saying that it's a very strong form of racism to say that you don't exist. then this is tragic, because to say to an Indian that you are not an Indian, it seems that you don't have any rights. So it is different, the Black movement, because there are other things involved in society. They were inside our society, and the indigenous for a long time, they want to be in their land. And so there are differences between what they ask for, perhaps, how they organize their demands in terms of always collective way. They think about collective feelings of group, or think. I don't know if is it this that you ask?
Yeah, and
May I, if I can?
yeah, I mean, I was mainly interested in the word reparation and how it came into the public debate.
I can't say. I
And,
can't say
and if it's like, because if it's how and if maybe resonates,
Resonate, but
if se faz sentido para grupos indígenas da mesma maneira, a palavra. Sorry.
Yes,
I think
may I ask a question, an observation, and after a question, I think this point of reparation, because I really agree with Regina. I think even the word, I'm not exactly see if the word reparation, I didn't do a research on this point, and I came from, I'm including the supervising of a thesis about the indigenous movement in the Constituent, and so they were there, very organized, and it was not different. It's even in parallel with the new Black movement of the 70s. I even have some doubts if some questions they came first, but this is really two parallel movements, and it's very impressive the coincidence. I loved so much to read the final. It's not defended yet, but I read the conclusion of the work. But more than that, I think that I read Regina works and also Vânia Rosada and others, that the indigenous movement in the 90s, especially the Aldeias, also claimed for original rights. So it's a form, the idea of reparation, it was always inside the political action of indigenous people in some way. So this is my observation. And the question is about that, to come from back to the 19th century or even the 18th century, to talk about, I think that could be interesting for everyone, or to talk about this claim for so that they want to continue to exist as indigenous peoples, but this claim is a claim for land, for collective rights, for an existence. So to say a little bit more about this kind of claim, there are political claims in before the indigenous movement of the 1970s, that it's this movement that we know now. But I think that is the idea of repair, maybe not the word, but connect to your question.
Clarified more.
But I understand that, but I'm interested because of the word reparation.
I'm not sure, really.
Yeah, because now when you say the word reparation, it has a specific meaning and is attached to a specific claim for rights. And I was wondering if with the indigenous groups,
I'm not sure if the word is there. I really.
I think now you talk, I'm thinking of, because nowadays you have these movements, because they have been deslocados, como se diz, several times obliged to change places. And so nowadays, I think when they leave, they go to another place, they want to come back to stay there another, I can't say original lands, because many times they were not original, they were lands that they had occupied later as groups. But I think, and then they asked for a kind of if they don't come back as well, but they asked for kind of reparation, given them in other lands, given, it's a kind of, I don't know, I can't tell you that they use this word, but I don't, yeah. Say, but the questions, you want to speak more?
No, no.
His answer.
I think that of the
we will
claim.
talk more about, yes, because I didn't explain that, because this is important to know about the indigenous policy, política indígena, policy que fala?
Indigenous policies, yes.
Indigenous Portuguese indigenous policy from the beginning, they were very, another thing different, I think, different from the blacks, is that the Portuguese were much more dependent on Indians than on the blacks. So that this make a difference as well. They make more concessions, of course, in the 16th century to the great leaders. And so the Aldeado Indians got this right to be in the aldeia in a collective land. All these rights were written or they had Seis Maria letters. They presented them. I have a document that where the first aldeia in Rio de Janeiro was São Lourenço, where UF is nowadays, where we work. And there is a descendant of Arariboia, the first captain major of Aldeia de São Lourenço. In the 19th century, there was a descendant of him trying to demarcate the land and showing the letter of Seis Maria that had been given to him. So and in the documents, the letters they wrote for asking rights, they always mentioned that they were people who had agreements with the king. They fight the wars supporting the king. So they had rights that had to be respected because of this. So they put all these things, they have these, and we arrive at 19th, it's very interesting, 19th century now, because 19th century was not very studied. Nowadays it's been very studied. And the movement, the political movements of the Northeast time of Regent and First Empire, for instance, Confederação do Equador and all these things, there were a lot of indigenous fighting in these wars. And it's interesting I have colleagues who works with these and identify why they were supporting one or another political group. And they could change, of course, from side to side, as indigenous also did, but it has to do with their past, their alliance they did before. And at the end, they were always trying to keep their collective lands. So they would support that big landowners in Northeast who supported them in their fights for keeping their aldeias. This was a very important issue, and they did this because they were Indians. They were always affirming their identity and their agreement with the king, and also sometimes support the king because it was the king who gave him the lands, the rebels and so on. So that's why it's always important to see the trajectory of the group themselves, the specific groups who are fighting, who are the leaders. I don't know if I answered, but there are lots of things they had clear. These things we did the agreement.
And the alliance is basically that they were there before the king. The idea that we are the original owners and we are like it's there somewhere.
I don't know if I.
Yes.
Very difficult.
Regina, thank you. I want to hear from you about the meanings of the Pardo category for the indigenous people in the perspective of indigenous people. And the comparison you did a little bit more about.
Interesting, they think, because pardos is a generic thing, and you know, pardos in Bahia are black, pardos in Northeast are Indians. So, and but and I think this is very interesting for us to see this difference, because while for the black people being a part, according to my colleague and friend here, Mato, being a part of a social ascension, being a part of for an Indian would mean lose the right of the community because he was not Indian anymore. So, but it's not. That's why after this, everything is complex. So, because there were also sometimes that the Indians could be interested in not being Indian, depending on the situation, on the specific. But as a general tendency, they refused. They formed themselves as Indians because of these rights they had, and mainly after Pombal's reform, because as Indians they were not going to be slaves. So the slavery was forbidden for indigenous people. So they refused to marry black people for not being slaves, for not being slaves. So, but it's quite complex and it's very interesting, this category of pardos, even today, you know, and the studies, but there are some studies about this. Larissa Viana makes a very interesting thing because they also affirm themselves against blacks. So, watch that has one petition. Remember the petition in Bahia? I don't know. It was not the Taylor's revolt. It was another one. The pardos had their own demands, putting themselves. And so that's something, and I must say that I began to think of these things, of questioning sources and classificatory things, but in this way of comparing one with another, with the studies of the people, with the studies of my colleagues of the black studies, Schwartz and all of you, because this in Brazil, the studies that thinks about these issues began 10 years earlier than the Indians ones. 10 years earlier. So a lot of questions that I see that were being thinking to reflect on the trajectories of the black people, I could think the same for the Indians. And mainly the thing about how do they see themselves in the social hierarchical. And it's always, this is why I really love this test of Schwartz. It's really the identities are constructed, taking into account the others. I am an Índio diabo. It's good for me to be that because there is a wild Indian and there is a black slave. So I am in a, and this matters. This matters. So we have to think of these when we read documents. So how try to understand how do they feel about the classification, and in there it's difficult, but there are clues on the sources that allow us to think of this. Not to be sure, we can't be sure about anything. You know,
I will just follow on Mateus because Pardo was one of the things that I wanted to ask you with these contemporary discussions.
Yes.
About Pardo, I think that's what you're
yes.
referring
And
to.
Afro-Indígena too, the
And
new category.
well, that's the thing. I mean, now with all the discussions about Pardo and claims to be Pardo and related to the skin color, I think that some of the contemporary definitions are much more essentialist than those that what we refer in the past. But it's a new use, and it's a political, of course, it's political. So I was just wondering if you're following this and how the indigenous, different indigenous groups are dealing with that discussion, because, I mean, I don't know if it's something that they are, or if it's something that is claimed by different.
So I can't say about the, usually they refuse to be proud or to be mestizo because they are Indian. But it's very interesting. And one thing more complex, I had a student who made a very nice, brilliant thesis. What is it? Paracaju, I don't, in Ceará, in interior of Ceará. And he studied the Caboclos of Iguarani. Was a group that affirmed themselves, the Caboclos of Iguarani, because usually the Northeast Indians, indigenous, they refuse the term caboclo, and there is always there's an affirmation of one of them that said, caboclo são os outros, nós somos índios, nós somos mesmo índio, caboclo. And they refuse to be caboclo because the lack of rights, it was implied on this. But the thesis of Vicente, in his thesis, he showed this group of Indians, end of 19th century, and also I think almost beginning of the 20s, they affirmed themselves Caboclo Guarani community with all the rights because they were Indians, but they called themselves Caboclo. They assumed. So it's very complex. You see, each group is a group. It depends on the meaning you give to the name, to the classification, the category, what it means for that group at that time. That's why we can't generalize anything. We can see it's, and so that's it. So it's very complex, but I don't know how the Indians today are looking at this thing about Pardo and being mixed, because they know that they have mixed. They are all mixed. And in terms of stereotypes, the Indians don't have. The Indians don't have a
Phenotype.
padrão. It's very difficult. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, we could stay here forever. Just
Yes. Okay, you can passar muito que vai sair.
Just one last. Regina, you were talking about this difference in the historiography that the studies about the indigenous peoples came like 10 years after. But I was thinking about that this dialogue is still something not very developed. What you are doing, for example, trying to connect the Black and indigenous history is something that is still needs to improve more and more. Do you see any reason for this lack of dialogue, or what are the challenges of this trying to do this conversation?
Yes, it's true. I don't know. It's very difficult. We have this as John. There's an interview with John Monteiro, which was by a supervisor, and there was a historian and also anthropologist. He was specialist in Indian things, but he always worked with Indians and Black. That's why I took the same way. And also because I told my friends, I always say that if I was going to give, even in my class, I give class Indians and Blacks, because if I was going to give class only on Indians, I would have 1 or 2 students. So I had to, but in these, so John had this interview that he said that unfortunately the fields of history were constituted in different, separated, which should be together. because they have so much in common. And then we have these, and even the movements, and they're separate. But I think that we are changing. It's Barbara Weinstein. She has a very interesting text about Africa, because usually in historiography, it's split as well. We have the Black America and the Indian American as different fields. So Brazil is in Black America. So that's why Indians were not studied here. The Indians were a theme, a subject for anthropologists. And Latin America is indigenous. And so she has a very interesting paper, a chapter in a book that she talks about these questions about ethnic and racial. Blacks are racial, indigenous are ethnic. So there are so many things to discuss, and we were, how can I say, the academic fields were constructed in this separated way, and we tend to maintain it. I remember in 2009, John in Ampu, Montero, we used to share the GTs, the simpósios temáticos. He said, Regina, let's go and do, the theme is going to be Indians and Blacks. I said, very good, but we won't have any work. So let's put it as a thing that would be nice. But because of this, it was the first time I began to think, I write something about them together, but just in methodological and theoretical way. I thought that it was how I organized it. But then after that, I'm still learning.
I was thinking that one of the things that makes this Latin American group, but Brazilian scholarship so interesting about this topic is the fact that you have those two not parallel but coincident processes happening at the same time during colonization, which is different than Africa, different than, let's say, Australia, where the natives Blacks because of their skin color, but also different than Africa because of the slave trade. That the fact that there was African slave trade and the native population at the same time, and both being online and being subject to racial classifications, and also of course, makes the Brazilian case in special, but of course not just Brazilian, really interesting to think, because those conditions of those two groups together really make a difference in terms of, if you think about the whole colonization process or expansion of European powers, that it's just, it complicates the sort of like dichotomy of the other colonization processes. And in Brazil, I think we are in this very interesting position to discuss this in terms of like anthropology and history, because of the complexity of all the ethnic discussions and the same time of the political claims. I was just thinking as you're, I don't know, I don't think there is any other place where the scholarship and also the claim for rights is as connected, but also as complex as in Brazil.
Yes, because
not that we just want to talk about ourselves, but, but I was thinking like where there is such a sophisticated and also politically oriented discussion at the same time. I don't think there is another place.
Perhaps Colombia, I don't know.
Perhaps
Colombia, yes,
yeah.
No,
But also it's all
Peter Wade and
in Latin America in that same context, right? So it's a Latin American discussion.
yeah, because I understood that we were talking about it's a place where since the 16th century, They were
Yeah.
together. They were together in the plantations.
In
In
the
the
slavery
plantations, they were
experience,
together in
yeah.
cities. They were together in many places.
And now on the project, I've been finishing Minas, but not only that. There is your work, John, also João Pacheco, to think the indigenous history connected to the African, Brazilian history, but there is also the opposite, even in the Black movement now, to think the Afro-Indigenous, to think the indigenous heritage in Black families in Brazil. This is very strong in the social movement, and also start to be, of course, it appears in the academy as a problem. This is interesting. It's something that became flourishing as a social question also.
Yes, there's a lot of political movements nowadays that's Afro-Indigenous. And the work
Yes.
here,
Yeah,
in the
this is
States,
why-
Nico, you,
Yes.
Brasil, pois é, mas
This is the title, though.
Okay, so thank you very much.